everyone, welcome to this episode of the Videoverse. As usual, I am joined here with my esteemed colleague Zoe Liu, and today we have a guest. I'm really excited to talk to him. Some of you will know who he is, but I almost guarantee every one of you will know what he's done if you haven't heard of him yet. But Steve, why don't you give us a really quick intro, who you are and what you currently do, and then we'll go and dive back a little bit into your past too.
Cool, great. Yeah, great to be here. I'm Steve Heffernan. I'm one of the co-founders of Mux, where we build APIs and other tools for developers working with video. Before Mux, I was a co-founder at Zencoder, the cloud encoding service. And alongside Zencoder, I created Video.js, the open source web video player.
And I guarantee everyone has used at least one of those products in the past here. If you have anything to do with video delivery, you've at least used one of them for sure. So Steve, obviously you have a really interesting history when it comes to video delivery. I'll just use that as my broad term, whether it's player, whether it's the encoding, what Mux is doing now on the development side. If we go way, way back, as far as we can think, what was your first encounter with video encoding, video delivery? How did you fall into this?
Way back, yeah.
Yeah, totally. So I got into streaming video like in the early 2000s, right? When we still had like the browser plugins, we still had Windows Media Player, QuickTime, Real Player. Flash was on the scene. It was still kind of gaining. It was gaining like user percentage, right? Flash came in and became that one plugin that 99% of users had, and so you could finally like stream video to one single experience as opposed to like across all these different plugins. But that's kind of like the context of when I got into it. And I was like early 2000s. I was working at my university. I went to Zeus Pacific University, and I was working on the website there. And we wanted to post like user testimonials, like student testimonials about why they loved the college, and we wanted to post videos online. And so they set me to task doing that, and nobody had done that before, and YouTube.
I was just going to say, it's pretty cutting edge, right? Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. Like, we definitely weren't the first like university doing anything with video, but like, yeah, YouTube didn't exist. Like none of the tools existed.
Wow.
And you really were building from scratch. And I, of course, as a young developer, totally over-architected the solution and like built way more than I needed to solve with like just get a video playing on the website. But yeah, Flash was there, and so first I had to learn how to build a Flash video player, which Flash, while it like supported across all browsers, it actually didn't come with built-in controls. Like there were no default video controls for Flash. You actually had to build the like play button and the time seek and all of that. You had to build that from scratch, including all of the logic behind the scenes to like track how that worked and all that. And so it was a really good primer for just like, this is how video works, video playback works, and like the fundamental details of how UIs come together, at least. But then at the same time, I had to learn video encoding, because we had to like create these video formats that would play on the web. And there's, I forget, I think at the time there was like Sorensen Spark, which was like the original Flash codec.
I used that. Yeah.
And then there was and VP8. VP8 was the one that like VP8? No, VP6. It was VP6. And then H.264 came on the scene at some point in Flash. But that was the kind of like progression of codecs that Flash could play at the time. And so like I was in what was the tool? Sorensen Squeeze at the time was the tool I was using. Yes. And I would like we had an Office iMac that was the one that like lived well. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I would set Sorensen Squeeze to like to like encode these 480p videos, and it would take all night long. So I was just like set it to go
Yeah,
overnight, and then they would like encode on this iMac overnight, and I'd come back in the
absolutely.
morning and like the videos would be done, and then I'd be able to like upload them to the
Yeah,
servers and see them play back in this
yeah.
Flash video player. So yeah, that was a really cool experience, a really big learning experience, and
No kidding.
yeah, went from there.
And so I'm guessing, and boy, I tell you what, so I was telling Zoe just before we got on here, what we're about to talk to, I'm about to ask you about. I feel like I was the beneficiary of so much of what you worked on. I was doing what you were doing, where you encode it overnight a bunch of times, only to come in the next morning and realize that it looked like garbage and you have to try again,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And you code it again if you have time. But I'm guessing so around that point, the next kind of phase was your dive into what became Video.js, the HTML player, right? Tell us
yeah.
tell us why that was a critical moment in kind of video delivery.
Um, yeah,
Or am I jumping too far ahead?
well, I'm trying to think if there's a few bits of context before there. I'm just trying to think if
Okay,
it's relevant. I'll just go through it and let me see if it's interesting.
go for it.
Um,
Yeah.
the before so like I started on Video.js in the early 2010 essentially, and so right before
Ah,
that
okay.
we had two things happening. One was uh, cloud, the cloud in general, like 2008 to 2010. Like this was like the birth of the cloud of Amazon S3 and
Yeah.
EC2, and that's kind of where
Yeah.
Zencoder like ultimately came from. But even before that, my co-founders at Zencoder and I partnered with On2 Technologies around like 2008. On2 Technologies is the creator of the VP codecs, so VP6,
Oh yeah, of
VP8,
course. Yeah.
and we had a partnership with them around 2008 to build a cloud encoding service called FlixCloud at the time, and it was like
Huh.
API to cloud transcoding, and it was powered by Flix Engine, the On2 command line based encoder. And we had that running on EC2 in the cloud, and people could send videos to it, and it would process it in the same way that cloud encoding services work today. That was like one of the first cloud encoding services. And around that time, the exciting thing was VP8. It was their new codec that was like better compression than the previous predecessors. Certainly at the time they were claiming it was better compression than H.264. And we built a whole service around it, and then On2 was acquired by Google, and because Google wanted to open source VP8 and basically make it royalty free for everybody, and VP8 became the WebM codec, the WebM format, right? Like VP8 was what was,
Yeah.
and so there's this like interesting progression of that, and so like Google bought On2. They wanted nothing to do with our little Flix Cloud service that was running on the side of what On2 was doing otherwise. And so they were like, hey, shut that down. And so we did that, but at the same
Interesting.
time,
Yeah.
we decided, okay, well, we'll build Zencoder instead. And so that's kind of like how Zencoder was born. And in that, we applied to Y Combinator, which is the popular startup incubator out in Mountain View, and we got in. We were surprised, but we got in, and that gives you getting into an incubator like that kind of gives you the excuse to just shirk all other responsibilities, move to Mountain View, and just focus on one thing for 3 months, right? And so we did that. We kind of left our families and girlfriends like where they were around the country, moved to Mountain View for 3 months, and
Wow.
just kind of like built Zencoder. We rented this like really interesting house up in the forest in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Like you take a small road to a smaller road to a smaller road, like in the middle of these redwood trees, like with the banana slugs and the turkeys, and we're just
Wow.
like hacking on Zencoder. And my two co-founders
That's awesome.
have families, and they were on the weekends they would go home to visit their families and leave me in the middle of this forest, just kind of doing whatever. And so at the
Wow.
time. So that's when HTML5 video was like this new thing that like early
Yeah.
2010 is probably supported in 20% of browsers at most, like 20% of users' browsers, right? You had to have like the most recent version of like
Okay.
Safari and things like that.
Yeah.
And so I took one of these weekends to just to hack on HTML5 and see if I could build a player on HTML5 in the same way that I built the controls for Flash back in the early aughts.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so that was a really fun exercise. I turned that into tutorial. That tutorial got picked up by I don't know if you're Daring Fireball. They were like a popular like blog at the time,
Okay.
and got picked up by Daring Fireball. Like 20,000 people visited the site, and it was like, oh my gosh, that's so many people,
Wow.
right? And so
Yeah.
turned that into a library that became Video.js essentially. So that's kind of the origins of Video.js. But yeah,
Wow.
at the time, I can get, if you want me to, I can then just kind of spill into like HTML5 and why that's kind of the important thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Why? Yeah, because that was, I remember as somebody who was implementing it, I was a customer, if you will. I mean, it was open, but it was a huge deal for us. But I don't want to say why it was a huge deal for us. I'm curious on your end why this was such a big deal to the industry, because obviously it changed everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the one thing I really like to mention that I didn't know that even I found some overlapping with Steve in some way because Untool was acquired by Google and become the
Yeah.
WebM team. So I was with that team for 3.5 years
Oh.
before
Oh, that's
I
right.
left and co-founded Vision Ruler. That was the team I was working
Oh,
with.
that's great. That's great.
Yes,
Wow.
because that was a team that they got VP9 out of VP8 and finally got VP1 and together with a few other AOL members.
Yeah. Yeah. So we were working with
Man, this
John Luther at the
encoding world
time.
is
So
tiny.
yeah. Yeah.
I didn't work with him, but I knew the name really well.
That's really great. Small industry.
Such a small world.
Yes.
Yes, big time.
Because I was really like, it's just like you told the story before I was born, kind of like that.
Exactly.
That's great.
It's funny.
I didn't touch the VPX series of a codec until I joined Google. I knew that, but prior to that, I was mainly working on H.263 first, and then H.264. That was my prior experience. I never got my hands on any of the open source video codec formats until I joined Google.
That's great. That's really cool.
It is interesting.
Go ahead, I think you're going to talk about more fun stories down the road.
Yeah, I was going to say it is interesting that back then Google was trying to do the open source thing, and some things seems like has never changed, right? They're still pushing that. Yeah, that's cool. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, your question was like, what was the impact? What was the importance of HTML5?
Yeah, it was a big deal.
I'll say, honestly, just from my perspective, initially, it just kind of felt right to begin with. Like the reason I started playing with HTML5 video was not because like, I was expecting like a big industry change or like opportunity or anything like that. It was that like, here is a native HTML element that is meant to play back video, and like it is built into the browser. It doesn't require this third-party application to pull in the browser, and it just kind of like, and you can use JavaScript and HTML and CSS to build your video player, as opposed to like, I liked Flash a lot, but like it always felt like this third-party other ecosystem that you had to deal with in order to do video in the browser. And so for me as just like a developer, that's what was initially most exciting to me about HTML5 video. The fundamental positives about it is that because you didn't have to run this like essentially separate application of Flash to get video working, you could hypothetically be more, it could be more performant than the Flash video player, at least certainly in the scheme of like what was required of your computer to run both the browser and Flash in order to get video to play, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's essentially what Apple pointed to. They may have had like a lot of other reasons, but one of the main things that Apple pointed to when they decided to basically put their foot down and say Flash will not exist on the iPhone, they pointed to the performance
Yeah, I
aspects
remember that.
of Flash, right? And so that's that's ultimately what killed Flash. It was that decision by Apple to not allow it on the iPhone.
I remember that.
I still
Yep.
think HTML5 video would have ultimately taken over just because of that nativeness to the browser. But I think it would have taken like many more years to get there, whereas like Apple really helped fast forward that progress. But it did mean like HTML5 video was still really immature in, I'm trying to remember when they really kind of cut it off. But we didn't in Flash. We had built this huge ecosystem of player technology in Flash. We had advertising, we had DRM, we had lots of interesting interactive features that were all working in Flash, and open source proprietary stuff like across the board. There's this big thriving ecosystem around video player development. And HTML5 video didn't support any of that for many years, right? We couldn't do adaptive streaming in HTML5 video until media source extensions, which was maybe like 2015. You couldn't do advertising easily. DRM didn't come out until around 2015, 2016. So like we were playing catch up with HTML5 video for a lot of years. So there's this really like awkward phase where it's like we had all this in Flash, and now like we've got to transition from Flash to HTML5 video, and we've got to do it fast because iPhone doesn't support it. But not everything's there. And so that was an interesting period. But certainly before iOS like made that, put their foot on the ground and said like we're not going to support Flash, the industry was really like reticent about HTML5 video. They were like, most people I talked to, they said like, oh, like only 20% of browsers support it, and like we have all this stuff in Flash that we already have. Like HTML5 video is never going to take over, right? Like there's that kind of attitude, right? And so I like after building this library, I kind of went out and like did a lot of speaking at like Stream Media and things and conferences like that, trying to convince people like, no, HTML5 video, that's going to be a thing. Like, get ready for it. And some people were like excited about it, and some people were like, I don't want to touch that. Like, that's just more complexity for our video players that we don't need. So, but at some point,
it feels like there's a kind of history repeating itself over and over again, because technology is technology. Everything you just described, we're kind of in that same position right now with some of the new codecs coming out and some of the new technologies within all of that, AV1, everything. There's a lot of, it's too complex, it's too resource intensive, and yet it's changing so fast that I think we're probably going to see a similar type of situation there. You had shared kind of a little bit of this history repeating itself approach about, basically the concept of the web components in the browser, which is different than what Flash was. We all remember those you got to update your Flash notifications. But talk to us a little bit about we didn't enjoy those. Talk to us about, in today's world, technology world, what does this mean for us video delivery wise with these web components in the browser? And I'm purposely being vague so that you can unpack it.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
You got it.
Yeah, like I think again, I'm okay. Firstly, there's this new technology in browsers called web components, and it is basically there's underlying technologies underneath that term, but the summary is like it allows us to finally create native looking HTML tags, HTML elements in the browser ourselves, as opposed to relying on the default set of HTML tags that have been there for the last 30 years, right? Like, so you know,
Okay.
before
Yeah.
before web components, like everything was a div, right? Like a div tag, like every like custom button, every
Yes.
custom like UI thing was just like UI built onto a div, this generic div HTML tag, and like you ended up with the div soup, where it's like divs embedded in divs, and just like all of the like semantic and
Yeah.
readable structure of HTML just kind of went out the door, because like we just didn't have like the tools
Right.
to like build our own HTML components into the browser. And so web components unlocks that ability. And the significance of that for video players is that, like, up until this point, we've really been like the video element, the HTML video element is kind of like the center of the universe for video in a browser. And there's a lot of good APIs that kind of like unlock what you can do with it, like media source extensions, and you can build controls on top, custom controls on top of that. But it's still kind of like limiting in ways, because like you can't do video outside of the video element. You couldn't do video outside of the video element easily. There's a few things that I think web components really unlocks for. Well, let me take a step back there. Because of the way the video element is, you end up with all of these like proprietary systems built to create all of these different controls and features on top of the video element. So like the YouTube player is like, you have the video element at the base, but then there's this whole proprietary system built on top of that that only YouTube uses. And then Video.js, it's open source, but it's this whole proprietary system built on top of the video element that like is not compatible with other video players, because like you really do have to build everything from scratch there because of the limitations of the API here. But what web components allows us to do is essentially like point to the video element API and say, okay, every video player out there, if you're going to expose an API in JavaScript, make it work exactly like the video element API. What that does is then make it so that if I create a custom play button, I can make like an HTML tag that is play button. I can just drop that in the browser and point it at either the video element or one of these players that's mimicking the video element API. That play button will work across both players. And in the same way, like you can then build additional media, you can build additional video players that work with an ecosystem of UI components that are all expecting this one API. And it's kind of a complex idea, but at the end of the day, like what it allows for is like an ecosystem of development where, as long as we're aligning on this like central API, this central API design, then we can now start working together. Like all of these different player development groups that are like solving the same problem in the browser over and over again can start sharing the code more easily in an ecosystem that we can find these different things and apply them together. It's interesting. A parallel is kind of like, I'm not an expert on like iOS video player development in the native iOS, like in Swift, or like Exoplayer and on Android. But you have these like a little bit like more closed ecosystems where you just know if I'm on work on Android, I'm using these components, right? I'm using Exoplayer, I'm using these components. If I'm on iOS, I'm using like the built-in like iOS buttons, and I'm really relying on like the Apple team to unlock like different player features, right? And so there's been like this benefit of those ecosystems to like actually pushing the video player progress forward, because it's like a little bit closed, but you can build in this like predictable ecosystem. Whereas on the web, the web is meant to be open, and yet we're building all of these like proprietary video players. We're not actually working together on the video components, right? Whereas like what web components actually opens up is for all of these different groups to now start like working on the same problems together. So I don't know if that explains it a little bit better. Does that?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm trying to wrap my head around it. It's really interesting. Is it, in one way, it's opening things up because people can start working together more, kind of the whole open source community concept, which of course then the danger is with anything open source, you know, you get some really good stuff, you get some not so good stuff because it's everybody and anybody. But this almost feels like it's, you know, the Apple way is to lock everything down, which makes it much more controlled, but much more reliable and predictable. This feels like a weird kind of mixture of those two. Am I thinking right?
Yeah, it's definitely on the end of the spectrum where we can now lean more heavily on the idea that we are working on the open web and we should be like sharing things more than building proprietary systems, right?
Okay.
Yeah. It's.
And so that, of course, would then. Go ahead. Sorry. I was going to say that would speed up development time considerably, I imagine, because we're not reinventing the wheel over.
Yeah, that's the thought.
And
we have some work to get there, but I feel as strongly about web components and what is unlocking for video as I did around HTML5 and what HTML5 unlocked for video. And so it's in a place where I think it's for a lot of people it's still blurry how that ultimately comes together. But I'm really excited for the potential where we're going. And we've started to build some things around it.
So are we going to find you? I'm sorry, are we going to find you at conferences on your soapbox preaching this now instead of HTML5?
I have a few talks out there, and I think I'm definitely beating a dead horse at this point. I'm
gonna have to look them up.
I'm probably getting very annoying on this subject, but yeah, I'm excited about it and telling people about it. We've started to build some projects around it. We have a few like media. For example, we have a few like media HTML elements where we have like a wrapper for like the YouTube player that exposes the same API as the video element. And then we have like a set of controls that we call media Chrome. And that's like controls that will work with the video element or any other player that works with the same API as the video element. And so like, that's kind of like this like kicking off point where we're trying to like kick off this ecosystem and help people understand what it means and start using these things. Yeah,
that's interesting. Well, Steve, I want to shift gears just slightly here. You know, this has been really fun. Walking down kind of in video delivery memory lane. And obviously the player.js was a huge piece of this. Zencoder was a huge piece of this. But today you're at Mux. And Mux, if I'm not mistaken, a big part of where Mux got their start, or I don't know how you want to phrase it, had to do with video data for the developer. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
And talk to us a little bit about that.
Cool. Yeah, so this around end of 2015, my Mux co-founders and I came together. We first decided we want to stay in video, which was a choice in itself. Like, do we want to go do some random social startup or something like that, or do we want to stay in video? And you know, we decided to stay in video, A, because, you know, we had all this expertise and knowledge in this, and B, just because like video is just so interesting. Like there's no end to the depth of like what you might learn when it comes to like advanced codec math and things like that, to like video player UIs and the complexity around that. Like there's just infinite depth when it comes to video technology. And so I think we were just really excited in general to stay in video technology. And we were kind of exploring, well, where's a problem in video technology that we could jump in and start solving for people like us who want to build more video related things. And at the time, so my co-founder Matt McClure, he I think it was 2013, he kicked off this San Francisco video technology meetup, which is, I think it's been running. It's had a meetup every single month since 2013 without a miss. And that's pretty amazing.
Wow.
No thanks to me. Matt is the brainchild behind that, and that's been really cool to see. But in that meetup, it's San Francisco, so there's a lot of people working on video technology specifically in San Francisco, and so we're able to develop friendships with engineers working at YouTube and at Netflix, and understand kind of like a little bit more of like what are they working with, like at that level of scale and that professionalism around video. And one of the things that stood out to us was this like just access to data and the power that they had around data platforms, which we had not seen otherwise, really outside of specifically YouTube and Netflix. And there's this ability to just like see everything like that was happening around the world on video players, on client devices, and understand like quality of experience metrics, like how much rebuffering are people seeing, and like what playback failures are happening, and details like that. But then also just being able to experiment and make a tweak to the UI or to the adaptive algorithm or to the codecs that are being used, and see the ultimate impact on watch time, so the overall engagement of the platform, of the video. Like, do people watch more or do they watch less if I make this change to my adaptive algorithm? And that was just like such a powerful concept to like be able to make those changes and see the impact, and continue to optimize your platform to the best experience you possibly can. And so we were excited about that, and decided to build a service around that, allowing other people to get access to the same type of data. And so that's our product is called Mux Data, and we launched that in 2016. And we've helped stream the last couple of Super Bowls with that product, and World Cup, and then a lot of other services are using that product to kind of do a lot of the same things that YouTube and Netflix can do with their powerful data. They can do with the Mux Data product, and that's been really cool just to get in. It was a completely different angle on video than video players and video encoding. It was like, okay, now it's video data, and it's a whole new world of like analytics and metrics and the math behind that. And so it's both like a sweet spot of video, but a whole new problem area to learn and understand how to do that well. And so, yeah.
No kidding. Yeah, and it's actually interesting to think that, number one, there was a day when that wasn't readily available to people. They couldn't get those kind of insights. They streamed a video, and then it was like, well, I hope it did well. I hope. I don't really know anything about it. So number two, then, while that has become, I don't know if I can call video data table stakes yet. To me, it is. To me, it's like, well, how can you do anything with video, both from a marketing to a business to a development standpoint, without the data? It does still seem like in the video world, correct me if I'm wrong, there's still a lot of people that don't realize the insight that's available, or if they do realize it, they don't know what to do with it. Do you think that's a fair assumption?
It definitely depends on what type of data we're talking about, because like we talk about video data, right? Like to your point, there's this wide swath of like anything from like just pure usage metrics to engagement metrics, and like what are the most popular parts of this video, to like rebuffering and player errors and things like that on that end of the spectrum, right? And quality, and so it really depends on, like, we definitely see anybody who's doing like a video streaming platform at scale, like they're deep into the metrics, probably across the board, both in the engagement and the quality of experience side of things. But you get to like, we talk to a lot of smaller startups too, who are just building like a video feature into their social application or something along those lines. And especially at the startup stage, you just have like all these fires and big initiatives that are like ahead of reducing rebuffering by 10%, right? Like to where like that level of data is you're not doing much with it yet. So, but and you're probably going to be first looking at the engagement, just understanding like, are people actually watching video in this application, and is it boosting engagement of the app before you're really focused on improving the overall experience.
Yeah, awesome. I have actually quite a few questions about respecting the time. Ask. So I just want to throw away, because you have been talking, starting with Video.js, and then now we're talking about Mux Data. So I'm just curious, why you use your own developed Mux Data to gauge Video.js, for example, compared with other like JavaScript or players? How's the result?
Why don't we use Mux Data to basically with video chat?
No, I'm just curious that using max data, then there's quite something you want to evaluate, right? For example, you just mentioned it's mainly the quality of experiences or the engagement of the users. So now, because just now we talk about players, so I just want to know from the player perspective and gauged by max data, how different players perform and manifested by the max data justifications.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Example.
There's one complexity first with Video.js in that like it's open source, and so I would love to just drop Mux data onto like onto like every Video.js install and be able to like understand the performance around the world. Like people don't tend to like that, like in an open source project, for it to come with like a data beacon that's built into it. And so we certainly haven't done that with Video.js and don't plan to. But on the, certainly like we often work with specific customers at Mux who are evaluating different players and like comparing like Video.js versus like Bitmovin and TheoPlayer and some of the other professional players out there. And so it really is interesting to see kind of like the performance comparisons that they do there. And it's interesting. It is very context specific. I wish I could tell you like, oh, this player is always number one, right? But it's very context specific. Like depends on the type of content you have, the length of content you have. Are you trying to go for like low latency, or do you not mind like latency, right? It's like all these details like ultimately come in to the specific context of what player is going to be right for you. So.
Yeah, so that's why I think there's a reason that's why you have the max data, right? Because you said it's really hard to justify whether this player is always the best choice, because the different scenarios, different requests, and so that's how max data have different perspective to like manifest the performance of a different scenarios.
Yeah, I will say like we just launched a beta of, we have a new open source player specifically for our Mux video product. And so now we're actually in the place where we get to use our Mux data product to optimize a player that we are in full control of. And so it's actually, 5 years later after building Mux data, we're in a place now where we can really like put it to its paces with a project that we're building ourselves. So that's been really fun. Yeah.
So it's basically like close the loop to make it like dig into player, because like along the line, for example, we also, because we are basically like for my experience, so for example, we are basically doing the encoder. This is mainly on the sender side, and then so we're wondering on the player side. For example, we always talk about like time to first frame or the frozen, like that kind of performances. So from the player side, because you created the Video.js in the beginning, this is mainly about technology. So what do you think, what would matter the most, for example, regarding the time to first frame? And what kind of technology is down there? And for example, also frozen rate, because video is always, we're talking about this is three-dimensional signal, right? If you just get a very good quality, that's just slideshow. But video is more about smoothness and more about the flow. So the frozen is also very important. And overall also, and we know that Max is doing Max video, not only for VOD, but also for live. And recently you also announced that you're doing the really low delay, RTC, that kind of streaming. So that means that there's also delay down there. So it's a delay for the first frame, and then frozen rate, and the overall delay. And then, just from the player point of view, can you just get some technologies, how this kind of like performance features can be further optimized by the player? And then further, I would be more interested that I know Max Data can have all the different manifest how this. So one is how the player is being optimized to make this kind of performance even better, and then on the other side, how Max Data kind of give the feedback to the player to make it even better.
Great. So basically, kind of like how can we optimize some of these like time to first frame and rebuffering or freezing metrics more from the player perspective, right? And
Right. Just a little bit of details, like from the technology point of view. I guess many players are
yeah,
trying to achieve
absolutely.
that.
Let me think about that. There's one layer that we start from on the Mux data side of things. We definitely we try and take at the high level the perspective of the viewer first, as opposed to the technology. It's really easy to start looking at the technology and just measuring the technology, but we try and stay at the level of like, what did the viewer experience? And so even like time to first frame, there's a subtle difference in this like this time to playback, time to first frame, startup time metric. Whereas if you're just looking at the time like the manifest was requested to when the play button to when the frame first showed up, right? You're really measuring the technology at that point, as opposed to if you're measuring it from like when the user clicks play or the player decides to autoplay. The subtle difference there is the opportunity to preload the video, right? Like you can have a strategy, right, where you like preload the video ahead of time, and then when the user clicks play, it starts off immediately, right? Because the video has already been loaded, right? And that's kind of the subtle. If we're just like measuring the manifest load time, that would give you a different story than if it was like what did the viewer experience, right? And so we definitely try and start from that perspective, and like just preloading the video is like the obvious thing where if you're really like trying to create like a good startup experience, that's the easy one to point to. But yeah, there's lots of then complexity. You have like interfaces like on mobile where you're swiping between many videos and like trying to get that like different applications like that. I know aim for like sub 1 second time to first frame, where they really want like if it's above 1 second, that's a failure on the time to start up, right? Yeah. And so they're doing. There, outside of even just like the player itself, you're juggling the memory of multiple players on the page and how you're swapping between those players and like preloading the videos in the background. Like if you're predicting this person's likely going to swipe to this next one, or this is the obvious next one that they're going to go to, you're at some point predicting like to start preloading that video so that when they do swipe, it's just ready to start going right away. So like there's lots of like interesting things you can get into from the client side to start optimizing the viewer experience and getting ahead of what you think the user is going to do. When you get into the real-time video technologies, like that's a whole nother level where we certainly found that like most people don't think of a difference between, let's say, live streaming and real-time video. Like when you just say live video, right? Like what we're doing right now, people would call live video, right?
Yes.
But this is like I would call this from a 1 degree more technical. I would call this real-time video, where it's like I would call like the Super Bowl live streaming, right? And the Super Bowl can have like 30 seconds worth of latency because like they're fine with that, right? They're fine with that. They're fine with they might want to like bleep out a cuss word that a news person says, right? And have the space to do that. And so they're like, latency is okay, right? Not too much latency, but like way more than like a Zoom call, a Google Hangout call. Like you really have to be sub 300 milliseconds to have like a really good conversation. And those are just like vastly different scenarios and at the end of the day, like completely different technologies, right? Like the real-time video side of things is WebRTC, and you're making direct connections between the client or the the media server in between. You're not using traditional CDNs, and so like traditional CDNs have like dramatically optimized like the distribution of content and commoditized like the price of delivering video at scale. And you can't use any of that with WebRTC. And so like there's lower latency but added cost when you start using that technology compared to like then HLS and Dash, which are still like chunking up the files, putting them on a CDN, caching them around the world, and using that commodity hardware to make video more efficient. And so like we are in a really interesting place right now as an industry where we are both trying to make WebRTC more scalable, and affordable, more scalable and affordable, so you can reach like tens of thousands of people with WebRTC at that like sub 1 second latency. And at the same time, we're trying to make the traditional technologies of like HLS and Dash and the segmented streaming, we're trying to decrease the latency of those technologies to try and get to the same place. And we're like, either way, like we just want to get there with both of those technologies. And so there's like some strategies you can use in between where you're like strategically, like if I was going to build a platform like Twitch today, which is like you have lots of long tail streamers who might be like, there might be like 0 to 1 person watching this live stream. You don't want to send that through an expensive encoding process where you're making multiple renditions and no one's ever going to watch that video for potentially millions of streamers, right? Like that would be inefficient. And so you might start with like, okay, well, let's just like connect this streamer directly through WebRTC and connect the first 5 to 10 like viewers to the streamer directly. And then once you get beyond that, then we'll kick in like HLS and start creating an encoded stream and start scaling up the stream from there. Yeah, so it's complicated from that standpoint. So I'm kind of rambling on that one, but that's a whole interesting landscape in itself.
But you already mentioned quite a bit down there. Yeah, so you mentioned that because people talking about delay, it's always like that when the delay is keep reducing to a certain level, and then completely, I think the use cases and scenarios are completely different, and which also requires the underlying technology to become completely different, like you mentioned. At least some of the technology talk about, at least nowadays that you mentioned, even low delay HLS may not be able to, right, to address, and then we have to go with WebRTC. And then you also mentioned that, I think you can make quite some bit info down there, like CDNs, or you also even mentioned that some of the renditions, well, it's nice to have, but they also mentioned if it's a long tail, then maybe we start from being conservative, right? You just connect that in several words you just mentioned, connect 1, 2, 3, 5 to 10, and then streamers, let's see what's going on. And if there's more coming, then we may just convert to some different solutions.
This is kind of the fundamental thing about videos is that it's still hard to scale, but it's also still really expensive at the end of the day, compared to like text, images, and things like that. Like video is still really expensive, and so you're put in these places where you have to make strategic like economic decisions around how you're doing encoding, when you're doing encoding, how you're doing the streaming, and I'm really excited about where I feel like just the video industry is going, because it feels like we're moving to a place where it is just a primitive of the web, right? Like in the same way that like text and images are just like, you just expect them to be part of a website. Like I think video is going that same direction where you just expect video to be part of a website, and what every company is doing, you're gonna be doing something with video. But it's that expensive video, that scalable video that we're kind of like still pushing up against. And if we can like unlock some of that efficiency and bring the costs down so that like, it is like more on the realm of like affordability of just like hosting images, then I think we're going to see a lot more use of video, and I think it'll be really cool.
Yeah. And it seems like we're on the cusp of a bunch of those things coming together here too. There's a lot of new tech that is doing just that, is what it seems like to me.
Yeah, the demand is definitely high, and like even though like we all knew that it used to be the past I think 2 or 3 years that in the pandemic a lot of videos are being consumed, and now people start to talk about maybe at least some of us on some of the days we're going back to the office, but the world is already like this. For myself, I think the world is already, we can't fully get away from online anymore. We can't go back to where we were before.
For sure. Yeah, right. Exactly. It is what it is.
Yeah. And cool. With more videos are being consumed, I think there's a lot of challenging but really rewarding and fun and fascinating problems down there.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve, this has been super fun. Thank you so
Yeah, this
much
is fun.
for coming on and being on the show, and just being willing to unpack your experience, share kind of all the highs and the lows, the challenges. I know that there's probably a lot of listeners that either had no clue, wow, I had no idea that's where it came from, or we're right in there with you and are happy to hear somebody else was fighting those same
Well,
battles,
yeah. Hopefully I
and
wasn't
here we are.
too all
So
over the place with all the
thank you so
topics, but
much,
yeah, this is
and
great.
we
Appreciate
look
you
forward
having
to
me on.
talking to you.